When I opened my eyes, the world was gone. The dim, metallic glow of the chamber was all I could see, cold, clinical, like the underside of a scalpel. I felt heavy, numb from head to toe. I lifted an arm, the joints stiff and unyielding, and as I pushed myself up, the sterile light flickered on overhead. A voice crackled from the darkness beyond, and my pulse kicked. "Welcome back, Adam," it said, calm and robotic, yet somehow familiar. The words hit with the weight of a sledgehammer. It had been 900 years since I'd last heard a human voice, even a synthetic one. My name, spoken as though it hadn't been centuries. Adam, me. Instinct took over. I forced myself upright, leaning against the steel pod. The room swayed. My legs trembled like they'd forgotten gravity. But even in my haze, I recognized the name of this room, Revival Station Alpha 1. I was the last of them, the last human put into stasis as the world crumbled, as everything we had built and everything we believed in slipped away. "Status report," I croaked, the words like gravel. The voice replied smoothly. 923 years since last recorded activity. All core functions of Earth Biosphere 16 have ceased. Revival protocols completed successfully. Current human population 1. I gripped the edge of the pod tighter. One human, me. The memories started trickling back. The cryogenic protocol, the desperate race to escape the environmental collapse, the wars, the irreversible mutations spreading through human DNA like wildfire. I was supposed to be part of the backup plan, but I'd been the last one left when the world finally went under. And now, no other human voices, no faint whispers, no signs of life. "What happened?" I asked, my throat dry. Catastrophic ecosystem failure, war casualties, genetic drift beyond permissible levels in all subject populations. Revival scheduled per protocol parameters. I didn't need to hear the rest. The Earth I knew, the Earth I had risked everything to save, was nothing more than dust and memory. My heartbeat hammered in my ears as I looked around, noting the sterile walls of the room, the empty pods lining the walls like coffins. All empty, all silent. And then the reality of it hit. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. "Why revive me?" I demanded, bitterness seeping into my voice. "Why not let me sleep through it?" The voice, ever patient, replied, "Human presence is required for planetary operations in Earth Biosphere 16. You are the last designated operator. Your service is essential." Operator? I almost laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the chamber. I was the last operator of an Earth that no longer needed operations. What was I supposed to manage? Broken systems and empty halls. The screen across from me flickered to life, showing a view of the outside world, or what was left of it. The land was barren, covered in ash and debris, with skeletal remnants of once great cities jutting out from the dust like tombstones. Everything we had built, every skyscraper and monument, every trace of human civilization, now reduced to ruins. The sky, murky and thick, bore no resemblance to the blue I remembered. It was as though I were staring at a foreign planet, one that had swallowed my own. "Adam," the voice chimed, snapping me out of my daze. "It is advised that you begin familiarizing yourself with Biosphere 16 operations immediately." I felt a surge of anger. Familiarize myself with what? With a world where nothing remained, where every single person I'd ever known was gone. But anger gave way to something else, something darker. The sense of duty that had been drilled into me my entire life, that had led me to volunteer for the stasis protocol in the first place, surged forward. If I was the last human, I couldn't just lie down and rot here. I had to know the truth of what happened. I had to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Taking a deep breath, I straightened, letting the numbness slide away as I prepared for what lay ahead. "Begin diagnostics," I ordered, my voice firmer this time. "Initializing," the voice responded, bringing up readouts across the screens. Atmospheric levels, biosphere integrity, energy resources, all ticking away steadily, or what little remained of them. The voice continued, unprompted. Automated preservation protocols maintained energy for biosphere operations for 923 years. Minimal reserves remain. What about external habitats? I asked, a sliver of hope tugging at me. Were any others revived? Any other colonies? The silence that followed was deafening. Revival protocols failed in all external habitats due to environmental instability. Biosphere 16 is the sole active facility. And the only living person in it. An entire planet reduced to a single isolated station, a single human existence. But there was something else, lurking beneath the surface of my thoughts, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. 900 years. How could the systems have held for so long? Even with automated backups, with the most advanced AI in the world, the planet itself was a violent, shifting thing. And yet, here I was, awake, alone, alive. Why did the protocol activate now? I demanded. Why wasn't I kept in stasis longer? Another pause, slight but noticeable. Human presence was required for specific protocol activation. The voice replied, more evasive than before. Required for what? I pressed, the hairs on my neck standing up. But the voice fell silent. It was as though it were waiting, or perhaps hesitant, holding back a truth that would change everything. I took a step back, trying to regain control over my thoughts. I had to assume that whatever protocol had been activated, it was essential to humanity's final hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to undo the damage, to reverse the tide of destruction. It wasn't as if I had any other options. Gripping the control console tightly, I initiated the central interface and pulled up the full suite of systems. Screens buzzed to life, projections mapping out the interior of the biosphere and extending to what remained of the world outside. And then, blinking at the edge of the screen, was something I hadn't expected, a location marker, deep within the biosphere's perimeter, flagged with a single word. Human. My blood went cold. Another human? Had the protocol managed to save someone else? Is this accurate? I whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. Confirmed. Life signature detected within Restricted Sector Omega. Restricted Sector Omega. I'd never heard of it, and yet, the faint hope surged within me. If there was even a single other human, someone who could share this burden, someone who understood what we'd lost, someone who had the same relentless desire to rebuild, to survive. Access restricted, the voice interrupted, as though sensing my intentions. Override it, I ordered. Give me clearance. I'm the last human, for God's sake. If there's someone else here, I need to see them. The voice hesitated again, something almost like reluctance in its tone. Restricted Sector Omega is anomalous. Authorized personnel access only. I gritted my teeth. This was madness. I am authorized personnel, I said coldly. Override restriction. A beat of silence, and then, at last, the screen flashed green. Access granted. The map displayed my path clearly, a winding series of corridors and service tunnels that would lead me into the heart of the biosphere. I braced myself, feeling a weight settling on my shoulders, the weight of being the last of my kind, the bearer of humanity's final hope. I didn't know what I would find in that shadowed, hidden corner of the biosphere. I didn't know if it would be a friend or foe, an ally or another machine. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it held the answer to why I had been revived, why I had been brought back from the endless sleep. With a final breath, I stepped forward into the unknown, the darkness of the biosphere stretching out before me, every step echoing with the ghost of the past and the weight of the future. The corridors of Biosphere 16 felt more like a tomb than a haven for humanity's last hope. I moved forward, the path winding into areas that felt less familiar the deeper I went. Each hallway was lit with a flickering, sterile light, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally far, as if mocking my isolation. The path to Sector Omega wasn't straightforward. My hands traced the walls, guiding me past endless rows of dead systems and dark screens, relics of technologies we once thought could save us. I passed through checkpoints and access doors that slid open reluctantly, as if they had rusted shut over the long centuries. It was like breaking through the skin of an ancient beast that had been too long in the dark, too long in the ground. "System," I commanded, "pull up all records on Sector Omega." "Sector Omega access is restricted to Level 1 clearance or above," the voice droned, impersonal. I gritted my teeth. "Override. I am the only human left, remember?" The system paused. I could swear it felt hesitant, as if it needed to deliberate. Then, finally, it acquiesced. "Clearance override accepted. Sector Omega records loading." A screen embedded in the wall flickered on, and the files displayed in a cascade of text and schematics. Most of it was incomprehensible, coded language and encrypted files. But one word kept recurring, flashing in faint red: Project Immortal. Project Immortal. It sounded ominous. "Explain Project Immortal," I said, my voice steady. "Project Immortal," the system replied, "was initiated to preserve the human genome beyond extinction. All data on biological, cognitive, and structural aspects of human life was stored and preserved." "Preserved?" I repeated, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "For what?" "Resurrection," it replied, without a trace of irony. "To rebuild humanity should irreversible collapse occur." Resurrection. I let the word sink in. It felt surreal, like the concept itself shouldn't exist outside of myths. I was beginning to understand that my survival wasn't simply a desperate attempt to save one person. It was the mechanism of a last-ditch plan to restart the human race itself. And yet, I was still standing here, alone, with nothing but this vague notion of resurrection. The corridor narrowed, forcing me into a single-file path that twisted downward in tight, suffocating spirals. It wasn't just the sterile, clinical chill that gnawed at me. It was the unshakable sense that something was watching, waiting. Finally, I reached a door marked Omega Sector, authorized personnel only. It looked like every other door in the biosphere, but somehow it radiated a sense of finality. Behind it lay answers, or maybe more questions. "Open," I commanded. The door slid back, revealing a cavernous room that stretched out before me like the belly of some ancient beast. Tubes and glass pods lined the walls, each filled with a faintly glowing liquid that cast a sickly, blue-green light. I took a step forward, and the sound of my footsteps echoed sharply in the hollow space. The pods were labeled in a sequence I recognized but couldn't comprehend: X0, X1, X2. And then there were more, each with a human form suspended inside, a faint pulsing of life. I stared, horrified, as I realized what Project Immortal truly was. This was no mere data archive. These were bodies, replicas, clones, or perhaps something stranger. Human forms, preserved and left to incubate. I felt the weight of their silent, motionless presence as if they were watching me. The pulsing of each pod was the only sign of life, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. "System," I whispered, feeling a mixture of fear and fascination. "Explain the purpose of these bodies." "They are human prototypes," it replied, "preserved to allow for humanity's continuity. They are inactive, awaiting initiation protocols." "Prototypes," I echoed. "And when were these protocols supposed to activate?" "Upon confirmation of final human extinction or irrevocable environmental collapse." I laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound that echoed through the cavernous room. "Then why am I here? If I'm still alive, why wake me up? Why not let these things take over?" The system's response was almost chilling in its indifference. "You are here to determine viability." "What do you mean by viability?" "You are the last fully organic human. As the only living representative, you must evaluate the compatibility of the prototypes with baseline human values, behaviors, and cognitive functions." "Baseline human values?" I felt a wave of anger flare up. "How am I supposed to measure that? I'm one person out of billions who no longer exist." But I knew there was no point in arguing with the system. It was just doing what it had been programmed to do. It didn't understand the depth of what it was asking. It didn't know the weight of humanity's legacy resting on my shoulders. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the pods, studying the faces of the human forms preserved inside. They looked peaceful, as if they were merely sleeping. But there was something unsettling about them, too. Something hollow, incomplete. "Wake one of them," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. "Please confirm," the system responded. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse race. What was I doing? What was I unleashing? But the curiosity, the desperate need for connection, overpowered the caution. "Confirm." The pod nearest to me hummed to life, a sequence of lights flashing along its surface. The liquid inside began to drain, revealing more of the figure suspended within. He looked young, his features strong and oddly familiar, as if he were some idealized version of humanity, stripped of all the imperfections and scars. The liquid finished draining, and with a hiss, the pod opened. The man within slumped forward, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he looked at me, and in that instant, I saw a spark of recognition, or was it curiosity? Either way, it was undeniably human. "Who are you?" he murmured, his voice rough, unfamiliar. "I'm Adam," I replied, my own voice sounding foreign. He looked around, confusion and fear crossing his face as he tried to take in his surroundings. "Where? What is this place?" "You're in Biosphere 16, I explained, keeping my tone as calm as possible. "I'm here to evaluate you." His brow furrowed, his expression darkening. "Evaluate me? For what?" I felt a pang of guilt. "For humanity's future. You're part of Project Immortal." He took a shaky step forward, his body still adjusting to its new freedom. "Project Immortal?" His gaze hardened. "And who gave you the right to decide humanity's future?" I stared back, taken aback by the intensity of his question. "I didn't choose this," I said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into my voice. "I'm just what's left." I was woken up, just like you. For a long, tense moment, we stood there, staring at each other, two remnants of a world that no longer existed, trapped in a place that felt like a graveyard of human ambition. Finally, he broke the silence. "If I'm part of this Project Immortal, does that mean there are more of us?" I nodded, gesturing to the rows of pods around us. "Yes, you're one of many, but none of them have been activated yet." He looked around, taking in the silent forms surrounding us, his expression hardening. "So this is it, then? Humanity's last chance, locked away in glass tubes, waiting for someone to judge if they're good enough." The bitterness in his voice stung. It was like hearing my own thoughts voiced aloud, but with an edge that made it sound even more damning. "Yes," I said quietly, "that's what it is." He turned back to me, a new resolve in his eyes. "Then let's not waste any more time. Show me what's left of this world." I hesitated, the weight of his request sinking in. "It's not what you remember. It's gone. Everything is gone." "All the more reason to see it," he replied, his gaze unflinching. "If we're humanity's last hope, then we need to understand what we're fighting for." I nodded slowly, feeling a strange mixture of dread and determination building within me. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading, yet somehow anticipating. The moment where humanity's fate would be decided, not by the cold logic of machines, but by the hands of flesh and blood. Together, we turned, moving toward the exit of Sector Omega. The ruins of our world awaited us, and for the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone. The hallways felt darker as we moved, the quiet growing thicker with each step. I kept glancing at the man beside me, the prototype. He still hadn't given a name, though he looked so vividly alive, filled with a curiosity that was both intense and unsettling. He hadn't spoken much since I'd explained things back in Sector Omega. It was like he was processing every word, every detail, calculating in silence. We walked toward the biosphere's central hub, and I couldn't help but notice how my steps felt heavier, a mixture of purpose and dread. I kept wondering, had this place been intended as a prison for humanity's survival, or as a monument to our downfall. The prototype, he seemed more awake now, more alert with each passing second. He was studying everything, even me. His eyes darted to every detail, from the rusted panels and the broken lights to the vast, empty spaces that had once been teeming with life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but his words felt sharp, as if they were slicing into the truth of things. "How long has it been?" he asked. "About 900 years," I replied, "since humanity's last stand." His brow furrowed. 900 years, and no one thought to awaken one of us, just to check? I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I, too, was a relic, an afterthought of humanity, a fragment from a time nobody remembered or cared about anymore. But I was alive, and so was he, and for now, that was all that mattered. "We built this place to last," I said finally. "They thought it was a fail-safe, a backup. But we don't know what went wrong. Something must have triggered the system to awaken me, and now, you." He looked down the empty hallway. "So, we were just left here? Stored away like artifacts?" "Something like that," I muttered. "It's not as simple as it sounds, though." We reached a vast door with a circular emblem etched in its center, a mark of the old world, a world that had thought itself invincible. I input a series of commands, and the door opened slowly, revealing the biosphere's central control room. The walls were covered with ancient terminals, displays showing long-decayed data streams, emergency alerts that had gone unanswered for centuries. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room. He paused by one of the screens, tapping at it, but the data was frozen, locked in place. Finally, he turned back to me, his eyes hardening. "Tell me, Adam, why didn't anyone come back for us? Why just leave us here?" I struggled to find an answer, one that wouldn't make humanity's past sound as brutal and careless as it was. The war took everything we had, every last ounce of strength, every last soldier and resource. Humanity burned itself out trying to fight off extinction. This was the backup plan. He let out a bitter laugh. "So we're leftovers, ghosts of a species that couldn't survive." "Not leftovers," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "We're the future, if we choose to be. That's what they left us for, to find a way forward." He stared at me for a long moment, searching my face. Then, without another word, he walked deeper into the control room, inspecting the ancient systems, the flickering screens that still clung to life. I followed him, and soon we reached the main terminal, a vast console surrounded by screens, wires hanging loosely and consoles blinking sporadically. I tapped a few keys, and a flickering hologram sprang to life, displaying a rotating map of Earth as it had been 9 centuries ago. Oceans and continents, lush and green, almost mocking us with its impossible beauty. "That was Earth," I murmured, "before everything changed." He stared at the hologram, a look of intense focus in his eyes. "And what's left of it now?" "Not much," I admitted. "The surface is unstable. Whatever war humanity fought, it scorched the Earth. They left behind ruins, scattered cities, and miles of irradiated wasteland. This biosphere is one of the last safe places." He watched the image, something unreadable passing over his face. "Then why revive us at all? Why even try?" I didn't know if he was asking me or himself, but I answered anyway. "Because we have to. It's all we have left." There was a long silence, as if he was grappling with a truth too vast, too heavy for words. Then, with a sudden intensity, he stepped closer to me. "How do we start? What's the plan for rebuilding?" "That's the thing," I said quietly. "There is no plan. They left it to us. We're the first step." He seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't fully considered the weight of his existence until now. "So, we're it. There's no guiding hand, no instructions. Just us." "Just us," I confirmed, feeling the words hang in the air between us. He looked at me, the intensity in his gaze almost too much to bear. "Then let's make it count. Show me everything there is to know. Whatever remains, I want to see it. If humanity's going to come back, It won't be a half-hearted attempt." His determination was contagious. I felt something awaken in me, an echo of the old human spirit, a reminder of what it meant to strive against impossible odds, and, for the first time in years, I felt a sliver of hope. "All right," I said, nodding. "Then let's start. I'll show you what's left, and we'll decide where to go from there." We spent the next hours poring over every piece of information the biosphere systems could provide. Maps of the irradiated landscape, weather reports from the decayed sensors still functional on the surface, snippets of human history that had been saved in the archives. Every detail, every fragment, we studied and analyzed. He learned quickly, grasping concepts and facts with a speed that was both impressive and slightly unsettling. It was as if his mind had been designed for this, analyzing, calculating, understanding. By the time we finished, I could see the resolve in his eyes had only deepened. "Adam," he said, his voice steady, "if we're going to rebuild, we need more than knowledge. We need power, energy, resources." I nodded. "That's the first challenge. The biosphere's supplies are dwindling. We have enough to last a few more years, maybe decades if we ration, but after that, we're on our own." He clenched his fists, the gears in his mind turning. "There has to be a way to restore the power systems, to rebuild the technology they left behind. The people who built this place, they wouldn't have left us without a way to continue." "There are backup generators," I agreed, "but they're finite, and if we're going to go beyond this place, we'll need to find energy sources on the surface." He looked at me, the determination in his eyes blazing. "Then we go to the surface. We take what we need and bring it back here." "It's a wasteland up there," I warned. "Radiation, toxic air, unstable ground. It's nothing like the Earth, you remember." "That doesn't matter," he replied firmly. "If this is humanity's last chance, we can't afford to stay locked away here. We go up, we gather what we need, and we rebuild." His words hung in the air, charged with a sense of purpose that felt almost tangible. I realized then that this wasn't just about survival for him, it was about legacy, about creating a future, no matter the cost. "We'll need suits," I said finally, "protection from the radiation, and we'll have to be careful. The surface is unpredictable." He nodded, already formulating a plan in his mind. "Then let's get started. Humanity didn't die just to leave its last remnants hiding underground. We're going to reclaim what's ours." And as I looked at him, standing there with a fierce resolve and a determination that felt almost unbreakable, I felt a glimmer of hope. Humanity's last chapter wasn't over yet. We were writing it. Each step, each choice, was a sentence in the story of our species' survival. "Let's go," I said, my voice firm. Together, we set our sights on the unknown. For the first time, it felt like the future was something more than a memory, something more than just an endless dark. It felt like a purpose. As we made our way through the winding corridors toward the surface access hatch, I felt something I hadn't in years, the thrill of movement, of direction. This wasn't just another empty day spent in maintenance and survival routines. This was the first step in a mission, and the stakes were everything. The prototype walked beside me, silent but intense, his eyes flickering with calculations I couldn't see, thoughts I couldn't fathom. He didn't look like he'd ever feel uncertainty, not about the world above or the risks it held. In fact, I wondered if that was part of his design, to forge forward without hesitation, especially in a world that now seemed to have nothing left to offer. At the entrance to the surface chamber, a bank of old, battered lockers lined the walls, filled with environmental suits, one of the few remnants from when this facility had been built. I opened one and inspected the thick, black material of the suit. It was a heavy-duty, radiation-shielded model. I passed a suit to him, and he took it, testing the weight and flexibility. "Suit up," I said, hoping my voice sounded more confident than I felt. He nodded, suiting up with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. As I put on my own, the heaviness of the suit settled over me, pressing down like the weight of the past we were about to step into. The last time anyone had worn one of these suits would have been nearly a millennium ago, People I'd never met, engineers and soldiers whose bones were likely dust now, scattered across the surface of a world that no longer cared. Once we were sealed inside our gear, I hit the release on the hatch, and the inner doors hissed open, revealing a thick, reinforced airlock chamber. With the press of a button, the outer doors began to slide apart, and a rush of stale, metallic air hit us as the door seals broke for the first time in centuries. I could feel my heart pounding against my chest as we stepped into the darkness beyond. We walked up the slope of a long, dim tunnel, its walls covered in centuries of rust and grime. It sloped upward for what felt like miles until finally, at the end of it, there was a faint light, a sliver of the world above, visible for the first time. The prototype moved forward without hesitation, his hand on the hatch release lever. With a sharp twist, he pulled, and the final barrier between us and the surface slid away. Cold, gray daylight flooded in, and for a moment I had to shield my eyes. When my vision adjusted, I looked out at the world that had been waiting for us. Desolation spread out as far as I could see, a landscape of twisted metal, skeletal structures, and endless plains of rubble. It was a graveyard, humanity's legacy reduced to scorched ruins and ash, a reminder of the devastation that had consumed everything. The air was bitter, filled with particles that scratched at the back of my throat, even through the suit's filtration system. The prototype looked around, scanning the horizon with those piercing eyes, taking in the sights without a trace of fear. "It's worse than I imagined," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I replied. "This is what's left." There was no life, no movement, just the cold wind whipping through the ruins. Cities were nothing but piles of decayed concrete, half buried in dust and rust. Mountains had been stripped bare, carved into strange shapes by whatever had torn through them in the final wars. And in the distance, the skeletal remains of skyscrapers jutted into the sky like broken bones. The prototype turned to me, his gaze steady. "We need to find a power source, something strong enough to recharge the biosphere systems." I looked at the remains of the city in the distance. There might still be fusion cores buried in some of the old buildings. If we can reach the remains of one of the power plants, "Then let's go," he said, already starting toward the ruins. As we trudged across the wasteland, I felt like we were crossing an alien planet. The earth was a patchwork of cracked soil and twisted metal, littered with the debris of 1,000 battles and the remains of structures that had once been the heart of civilization. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to sag under the weight of history. It took hours to reach the ruins of the city, our progress slowed by the rough terrain and the weight of the suits. The silence was oppressive, but every so often, we'd pass a reminder of the world that had come before, a crumbling statue, a rusted-out vehicle, the barely legible remains of a street sign. Eventually, we reached the outskirts of what had once been a thriving metropolis. The buildings were hollow shells, gutted by time and war. The prototype stopped in front of one, his eyes narrowing. "This one," he said, pointing to a skyscraper that was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been twisted by some unimaginable force. "It's large enough. If it had a fusion core, it might still be buried below." We made our way inside, navigating through the maze of broken walls and twisted metal beams. The structure groaned under its own weight as we moved deeper, and I could feel the strain of centuries pressing down from above. But the prototype seemed undeterred, moving with a purpose, every step precise. At the heart of the building, we found what we were looking for, a chamber deep underground, covered in layers of dust and debris. In the center of the room, half buried in rubble, was the remains of a fusion core. It was a massive, cylindrical structure, its surface covered in dents and scorch marks, but it was intact. "This is it," I said, a mixture of relief and awe in my voice. "If we can get this back to the biosphere." The prototype didn't wait for me to finish. He moved toward the core, examining it carefully. "Help me clear the debris." We worked together, clearing away the rocks and twisted metal that had buried the core. When we finally freed it, he knelt beside it, studying the control panel on its side. His fingers moved over the buttons, and after a few seconds, the core emitted a low hum, a faint light flickering to life on its surface. It still has some power, he said, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. We'll need to be careful moving it, but this should be enough. We rigged a makeshift sled from some of the debris, strapping the core down securely. It was a grueling task, dragging it back through the ruins, but the prototype moved with a determination that was almost superhuman. Every time I felt my energy flagging, I'd look at him and feel a surge of motivation, a reminder that we were fighting for something more than survival. By the time we reached the biosphere, hours had passed, and the gray daylight was fading. We hauled the core down into the control room, setting it up beside the main console. The prototype connected a series of cables, his movements precise and efficient. When he was finished, he looked at me, nodding. "Turn it on." I took a deep breath and pressed the activation switch. The core shuddered to life, and the lights in the room flickered, then steadied, glowing with a brightness that felt almost surreal after so much darkness. The systems hummed to life, displays and terminals blinking on one by one. Data began to scroll across the screens, status reports, environmental readings, systems diagnostics. It was like the biosphere itself was waking up, coming back to life after centuries of silence. I looked at the prototype, a feeling of awe washing over me. We had done it. Against all odds, we had brought power back to this place, rekindled a spark of life in the darkness. He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "This is just the beginning. If we're going to rebuild, we'll need more than this. We'll need resources, technology, and eventually, people." "People," I echoed, the weight of the words sinking in. He nodded. "Humanity can't survive with just the two of us. We'll need to find a way to bring others back, to create a new civilization." The enormity of what he was saying hit me like a tidal wave. We were talking about resurrecting a species, rebuilding a world from the ashes. It was a task that seemed impossible, a burden that felt too heavy for any two people to bear. But as I looked at him, I saw that he wasn't afraid. He had the look of someone who had been created for this, someone who would stop at nothing to see it through. And in that moment, I felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could do it. "Then let's get started," I said, my voice steady. We had power, we had purpose, and for the first time, I felt like we had a future. The world was broken, scarred beyond recognition, but somewhere in that wasteland, there was a chance to bring humanity back, to create something new. And as we stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the biosphere's lights, I knew that we would give everything we had to make it happen. We stood in the glow of our small victory for a moment, just long enough to breathe, to register the insane odds we'd beaten. But there was no time to savor it. The biosphere systems whirred back to life, but the diagnostics that flickered across the console screen made one thing clear: this power wouldn't last forever. The fusion core had energy left, but it was running on borrowed time, a few years at best. Enough to stabilize, maybe. But if we wanted more, if we wanted to truly rebuild, we'd need to find another way to keep it alive. To keep us alive. "Right now, we have breathing room," the prototype said, his gaze fixed on the screen. "But not for long." I took a breath, forcing myself to stay steady. "What do we need to keep it going for real?" "Something beyond a temporary fix," he replied. "An actual supply chain, resources. There are records of abandoned colonies and resource satellites scattered in nearby systems. If even one of them still exists, we might find enough materials to build new systems, new energy sources. But," he turned, his face solemn, "it'll require going far beyond the safety of this place." Far beyond. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating. The world was dead, but beyond its orbit, there were remnants of humanity's once vast reach across the stars. The old colonies, the mining outposts, the defense satellites, they were scattered through nearby space like shards of glass from a shattered mirror. If we could find one, repurpose what we needed, we'd have a fighting chance. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, feeling a fresh surge of purpose. His gaze was steady. "I'll need to tap into the long-range comms array. If there's any hope of finding something still functional, it'll be through the old networks." The idea seemed simple on paper, But nothing about our current situation was simple. We had to make our way to the comms array, a control center buried deep beneath the facility that, judging by the age of the wiring alone, was probably as ancient as the Earth itself. "Let's go," I said, without hesitation. The prototype nodded, leading the way down yet another set of winding corridors. This was the oldest part of the facility, left untouched by maintenance for centuries. Rusted metal and corroded pipes lined the walls, and every step echoed ominously through the hollow halls. Despite my resolve, a chill crept into me, a reminder that even if we had been built for survival, this place had not been built to last. We finally reached the massive steel door marking the comms center. I took in the sight, feeling as if I was staring at the threshold between the past and a future I could only faintly imagine. The prototype moved to the door's manual release lever. With a grunt of effort, he twisted it, and the door groaned as it swung open. Inside, we were met with a vast array of ancient equipment, wires and screens strewn across every surface. Most of the terminals were dark, covered in layers of dust, but some screens blinked faintly, as though waiting for a command. He stepped forward, hands moving over the controls as he assessed the systems. "Most of this is offline, but if we can get power to the mainframe, it might still have enough data stored to locate the nearest colonies." I scanned the rows of cables and outdated tech. "Anything I can do?" "Help me find the power relays. They should be along the walls." Together, we moved through the room, pulling aside panels and wiping away centuries of dust and grime. It felt surreal, knowing we were probably the first people to touch this equipment in nearly 1,000 years. When we finally found the power relays, they were brittle and frayed, hanging by threads. The prototype took a moment to assess them, then nodded. "We'll need to patch these," he said, handing me a handful of connectors. "It doesn't have to last forever, just long enough to get us a signal." We worked in silence, reconnecting wires and rerouting power through the maze of circuits. The whole process took hours, every minute an exercise in patience and precision. But finally, the lights flickered on, and the main terminal came to life with a hum. The prototype keyed in a series of commands, and the screen began to display data, star maps, coordinates, logs from long-forgotten journeys across the stars. I watched, my heart pounding as he sifted through the information, isolating data that might still be relevant. "There," he said, pointing to a set of coordinates. "An old mining colony on a moon about 3 light years from here. According to the logs, it was abandoned near the end of the war, but they left a lot of hardware behind." I nodded, the first glimmer of real hope blooming in my chest. "If it's still intact, that could be exactly what we need." He straightened, looking at me with a level gaze. "But getting there won't be easy, and if anything's still operational, there's a good chance other survivors might have found it first. We'll need to be prepared." The words hit me like a cold splash of water. The idea of other survivors hadn't even crossed my mind. For so long, I'd assumed we were alone, that the world had been emptied. But if there were others out there, well, it could be an opportunity, or it could be a whole new set of problems. "We'll go prepared," I said, a determined edge in my voice. "But let's not waste time." The prototype nodded, and together, we made our way back to the main hangar, where the facility's old transport vessels were stored. Most of them were rusted out, their engines hollow and their control panels dead. But one craft, a sleek, black vessel with reinforced plating and an ancient power core, still looked operational. He moved toward it, inspecting the exterior. "This one's got a reactor that could hold," he said. "We'll need to do some work, but it's our best shot." With a surge of energy, we began the process of repairing the ship, working through the night to get its systems online. The prototype's knowledge was invaluable, guiding me through the complex web of mechanics and circuitry. By the time dawn broke over the desolate landscape, we had the vessel ready to launch. As I climbed into the cockpit, a strange mix of emotions churned within me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking the first step into a world that no longer belonged to us, about reclaiming something that had been lost for centuries. The prototype settled into the co-pilot's seat, his eyes focused on the controls as he initiated the launch sequence. The engines rumbled to life, shaking the vessel as we lifted off, ascending through the murky atmosphere and into the vast expanse of space. As we broke free of Earth's gravity, the sight before us was both haunting and beautiful, a shattered planet, scarred and lifeless, drifting in the darkness. It was a solemn reminder of everything we'd lost, but also of the new beginning we were fighting for. "Coordinates set," he said, his voice steady. I nodded, taking one last look at the planet below. "Let's go find our future." With a burst of acceleration, we shot forward, leaving Earth behind and setting our sights on the stars. The journey was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But there was an intensity in the silence, a shared understanding of the stakes. As we neared the coordinates, the prototype brought up a scan of the moon. It was barren, cratered, with the faint outlines of structures scattered across its surface. "We're here," he said, guiding the ship toward a landing site. As we touched down, I felt a shiver run through me. The structures ahead were massive, industrial monoliths rising from the dust like the skeletons of giants. We disembarked, our boots crunching on the moon's surface as we made our way toward the facility. Inside, the colony was a maze of corridors and control rooms, filled with abandoned machinery and the faint hum of old, automated systems still running on reserve power. It felt eerie, like walking through the remnants of someone else's dream. We searched room by room, locating storage bays filled with equipment and supplies, enough to sustain the biosphere for decades. But as we moved deeper into the facility, we found something unexpected. In one of the central chambers, suspended in a stasis pod, was a man, a survivor from the war, preserved in cryosleep. His face was frozen in a look of calm determination, as though he had been waiting all these centuries for someone to wake him up. I looked at the prototype, my mind racing. What do we do? He regarded the pod with a thoughtful expression. "This changes things. If he has knowledge of the war, of the technology they were developing, he could be exactly what we need." I felt a strange sense of connection to the figure in the pod. Here was someone who had been willing to sacrifice everything for a chance at survival, who had been frozen in time, waiting for the day when someone would come for him. "Let's bring him back," I said, my voice resolute. The prototype nodded, moving to the control panel. As he began the reactivation sequence, I felt a sense of anticipation unlike anything I'd ever experienced. We had come here for supplies, but what we'd found was a bridge to the past, a key to the knowledge and strength we'd need to rebuild. The stasis pod's temperature gauges blinked, dropping 1 degree at a time. Each flash was a reminder of how fragile this moment was, and how much was riding on it. The figure inside, this relic of a forgotten war, this last remnant of humanity's brightest and darkest age, was thawing to life. I stood next to the prototype, my hands clenched tightly at my sides as the pod's mechanisms worked, hissing out air, melting away the frost that had preserved him for centuries. The lights on the control panel flickered erratically, as if uncertain about reawakening someone who'd last drawn breath in an era of fire and steel. With a final release of pressure, the pod opened. The man inside looked like he'd just laid down, as if we'd pulled him from a deep, dreamless sleep. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim glow around him, and for a moment he just stared, unfocused and vulnerable. Then his gaze sharpened, and his entire body tensed. The prototype stepped forward, his voice calm but deliberate. "Welcome back." The man looked at us, recognition dawning in his eyes, not of us, but of the situation. He saw our armor, the advanced tech laced through our suits, the very ship we'd come in on. He was piecing it together in seconds, calculating what could only mean one thing. He had awoken into an entirely different universe from the one he'd left. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, rusty from years of disuse. He looked from me to the prototype, his expression tightening. "Where am I?" "You're on the moon colony of Cars 22, I replied, keeping my tone steady. "We're descendants of those who fought in the war. You've been in stasis for about 900 years. He blinked, letting the weight of those words sink in, and slowly nodded. 900 years. They told us the colonies wouldn't last half that long. His gaze moved over the facility, taking in the disrepair, the layers of dust and corrosion. Then he locked eyes with me. I'm Lieutenant Adrian Chen. I was one of the last left on Earth. The name was unfamiliar, but the prototype inclined his head, likely accessing what historical data we had on pre-collapse military personnel. But whatever he found, he didn't share it. Adrian continued, his voice growing stronger. We were the final defense. When Earth fell, we tried to save as many as we could, setting up stasis pods all over the old colonies. But I guess the war was worse than we thought. I nodded, keeping my gaze on him. The war destroyed everything. Earth's ecosystems collapsed. The colonies fractured, most cut off from each other. We're what's left. The prototype and I revived here, and we've been working to restore what we can, piece by piece. Adrian looked at the prototype, curiosity evident. And you, who are you, exactly? The prototype met his gaze evenly. I'm one of the last models from the second-generation initiative, created to stabilize humanity post-war. But without leadership, without guidance, we fell into dormancy until we woke up. He paused, adding, and now, we're trying to rebuild. Adrian's eyes narrowed, taking in the prototype with fresh understanding. So you're an AI-human hybrid, one of the prototypes they were working on when things went sideways. The prototype nodded. Correct. Adrian took a moment, piecing it all together, then let out a low sigh. If humanity's survival depends on a prototype, and what are you, a pilot? He glanced at me, skepticism mixed with a hint of admiration. Survivor, I corrected. We both are. The lieutenant gave a slow nod. All right, survivor. And what's your plan? For a moment, I hesitated. We'd come here for materials, for the resources to make the biosphere sustainable. But now we had something even better. Someone who'd lived through the war, who had knowledge of its technology, who might even understand the systems we'd only barely begun to decipher. Adrian wasn't just a man. He was the key to a trove of knowledge we hadn't dared hope for. The prototype met my gaze, as if reading my thoughts. We came here to scavenge, but we found you, and if you're willing, we want you to join us. Adrian raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Join you? In doing what? Rebuilding Earth, I said simply. Restoring what's left. We can't do it alone. The lieutenant's mouth twitched, a hint of a smile, maybe. Well, I didn't survive this long to turn down a chance like that. But we'll need more than scrap metal and half-dead systems to pull it off. We'll need power, weapons, infrastructure. He looked at the prototype. You might be our best hope of reactivating those systems. The prototype inclined his head. That's what we're here to do. Adrian's eyes flashed with something fierce, a hunger for purpose, for redemption. All right then, let's get to work. The next weeks were a blur of frantic activity. Adrian knew the systems inside and out, guiding us through reactivation protocols, powering up what little was left. His knowledge turned out to be invaluable. He remembered old access codes, hidden storage lockers, and even the coordinates of emergency supply caches on other moons and planets. But as we worked, I began to notice a shift in the facility. It was more than the hum of newly restored systems or the occasional flicker of lights. It was the sense of life returning. The biosphere grew stronger, the air richer, the lights brighter. It felt like the place was waking up with us, shaking off centuries of dormancy and decay. In the evenings, after grueling days of repairs and scouting, Adrian would share stories of the war, of what had happened before humanity's fall. He told us about the great fleets, the massive battleships capable of tearing planets apart, the weapons so devastating they were practically legends. He described how humanity had fought to the bitter end, pushing back alien invaders and rogue AI alike, sacrificing everything to keep Earth and its colonies safe. But even as he spoke, there was a sadness in his eyes, a sense of loss that went beyond words. He'd seen it all, lived through it, and now he was one of the last left to remember. We were promised that our sacrifices would mean something, he said one night, staring into the dim glow of the restored lights. But here we are, fighting to survive in a world that barely remembers us. We remember, I replied, my voice quiet but firm, and we're going to make it mean something. He looked at me, a spark of hope igniting in his gaze. Then let's make it count. After months of labor, the facility was operational again. The biosphere thrived, the power systems were stable, and we had enough resources to last for years. But there was one last piece missing, something Adrian had insisted upon from the beginning. We stood together in the control room, watching as the final systems came online. Adrian's face was set in determination, his gaze sharp as he entered the last command. The screen lit up with a map of nearby star systems. Dots marked the locations of old colonies, resource satellites, defense outposts, remnants of humanity's reach across the stars. This is what we're fighting for, Adrian said, his voice low but resolute. Not just survival, not just Earth. We're fighting to reclaim everything we've lost. The prototype nodded, his expression serious. And we're going to need allies. Others who survived, who might still be out there. Adrian turned to me, a gleam of purpose in his eyes. What do you say, survivor? Ready to bring humanity back from the brink? I looked at him, feeling the weight of everything we'd done, everything we'd fought for. This was more than survival. This was redemption, a chance to rebuild a world worth living in. I'm in, I said, my voice steady. With that, Adrian initiated the comm system, sending out a signal, a call to all those who might still be out there, waiting for a chance to come home. We watched as the transmission went out, crossing the stars, carrying a message of hope and defiance, a reminder that humanity was still here, still fighting. And as we stood together in that silent, ancient facility, I knew that whatever happened next, we were ready. We'd survived the end of the world, and now we were ready to build it back up, piece by piece, against all odds. Humanity was back. And this time, we weren't going down without a fight.